Superhero fans, it's the year of our Lord 2025, and it's time to talk about Warner Brothers' latest attempt to kickstart the DC Cinematic Universe. Look in the sky. Is that a squirrel? Superman? Or just another attempt by DC to hop on the superhero bandwagon 5+ years after the wheels fell completely off? Lucky for you, fellow cinema enjoyer, it's all three. Superman 2025 marks the official return of the Man of Steel, but not that Man of Steel. And not that Returns either. It's no secret that DC Cinematic Universe is littered with the corpses of half-baked franchise failures and inexplicable one-off successes. And it stands as one of the most divisive and costly experiments we've ever seen in the history of film, producing 14 films in the officially titled DC Extended Universe, and of course a handful of Batman spin-offs, and only 2 of those productions ever crossed the billion-dollar mark. And the craziest part is that both of those successes occurred after the DC Extended Universe was pretty much officially dead, which makes the DC Cinematic Universe an undeniable failure compared to the MCU, and its overwhelming amount of hits they produced prior to and with Endgame. You guys remember Endgame? A movie that broke all conceivable metrics of financial and cultural success, and cemented itself forever within the annals of pop culture history? So who better to steer the ship of the new DC Cinematic Universe than James Gunn, one of the MCU's premier directors who rocketed the unknown Guardians of the Galaxy to mainstream relevance. And if he can do that for a talking raccoon, then maybe he can do that for one of the least known heroes in the superhero genre. Superman. Despite the cruel irony, Superman 2025 represents Warner Brothers' last desperate gambit to recapture the superhero film magic of the 2010s. And despite some questionable story beats, more than a few comedic misses, and maybe an extra storyline or two, the film mostly succeeds in spite of and because of everyone involved with this production. Now we're gonna make like Ezra Miller and briefly slide through this plot because it is a very dense movie, coming in at only 2 hours and 10 minutes, but it has 3 concurrent storylines at the same time, so many characters, and of course so many moments built on the classic Gunnerisms that we've come to know and perhaps not love from the Guardians of the Galaxy's franchise. From here on out, this whole video will be spoilers. I'll be pulling no punches, but I'm gonna start by saying that this Superman is definitively the best Superman of the 21st century. There really isn't any contest here. He's the one who matches the energy of a comic book Superman the most. What really makes James Gunn's Superman work is that it focuses on the heart of Superman, his inherently good nature, the internal struggle of knowing he's an alien with superior power to pretty much everyone on the planet, but forcing himself to live by a stricter moral code than his contemporaries. Another primary theme is how justice and the law often don't see eye to eye, and that is illustrated in the difference between Superman and the Justice Society and the government and Lex Luthor himself. The film is also about realism versus idealism, and this is embodied in the way that Superman will stop to save even the tiniest creature while fighting giant monsters or monolithic enemies, while everyone else who is arguably equally as capable as him will simply smash the target. I've heard some people saying that this movie is woke, and I gotta say, there's an undeniable undercurrent within the plot, and I mean the James Gunn's press tours have told us as such. This is an immigrant story, this is a story about the world, but thankfully it's all very muted and perhaps not even consciously included. A lot of it just seems par the course, so minimal that it gets brushed over very easily. And in fact, the times where it really tries to play up the message, it comes off incredibly comedic, perhaps unintentionally so, but just very silly moments that we'll describe as we go through this plot. Now, James Gunn makes the bold decision to start this movie right in the middle, with Superman crash landing to Earth, having been defeated in a battle against Lex Luthor and his superhero soldier. He has to call on Krypto the Superdog to take him to the Fortress of Solitude, and Krypto is a bit unruly. That's something we'll talk about later, but what I enjoy about this beginning is very much like the recent run of Spider-Man's. They know that you know the origin of Superman. It's already well ingrained in pop culture, and thereby you don't really need to establish it. Everyone knows the basics. Superman, alien, crashed to Earth, raised in Nebraska, Kansas, somewhere in middle America. He's really a Boy Scout among Boy Scouts, and another aspect of this intro I like is that it's really a filter for the audience. you have to decide very early if you're in or out with this movie, because we have a Superdog, we have a Fortress of Solitude, we have Superman 3 years into his career already defeated on the ground whistling, and it only gets crazier from there. But it allows the plot of this movie to be very free, to be one of the weirdest sci-fi films that I've watched in recent memory. In addition to all that, within the first 15 minutes we're exposed to some other weird things, such as Superman's Kryptonian parents, his robots and Kryptonian technology, and they even stuff in a fight with a throwaway villain who, spoiler, actually is working with Lex Luthor to bring down Superman. This first 15 minutes really acts as a sizzle reel to the entire film. It exposes you to the retro future technological style. It's much more comic booky than the Snyder films, anything in that DCEU, because they're calling this the DCU now, so we'll start calling it that from now on, I guess. And while I question if this film will have legs, since it's gonna hard filter people who aren't into superheroes, and some aspects of it aren't translating too well overseas, some people find it corny or very pro-American, it definitely sets a more positive and colorful tone for future DC projects. One thing in particular I want to talk about is the selfie girl, and she was causing quite a commotion when the first trailers were released, and she's definitely causing a commotion in this movie throughout the whole movie, and I take that as actually being a positive, because the screenwriting in this movie is so tight. Pretty much everything that's introduced in the beginning of this film is going to be used up until the end. All the characters are important. In truth, the movie could be a bit longer, but I think what gives it the punch is that it strays away from the 2.5 hour time mark and goes much closer to the 2 hour time mark. Except for the minor stops for Gunnerisms, there really is no wasted time in this movie. I also want to address the drama around the lenses used in this movie, because there's select frames that people pulled out of the trailers where we got super foot right here, and even the weird cross-eye effect on Superman while he's flying. But again, this is another thing that pays off with a later action scene that's actually super dynamic, and it's because they've used this lens throughout the film, and essentially they take this perspective up to 11, and we'll get there in a second. After all this, we're introduced to Clark Kent and Lois Lane, and they have a brief interaction at the newspaper before going back to Lois's apartment, and this scene actually was kind of weird. To start with, Lois and Clark are immediately hot and heavy, you know, getting down on the countertop in her little kitchenette. And while in story they've probably known each other for a couple years, it is a backwards way to do romance for the audience. It's James Gunn obviously trying to save some time, but it really feels like there's no escalation to the physicality. And there's also some odd lines in here, like maybe they didn't get the conversation quite right and they had to patch it together in the editing room, or it seems like there's some repeated dialogue here. It just came off very stilted. And spoilers within the spoiler zone, later on there's gonna be the classic superhero kiss where Lois Lane and Superman are floating up into the sunlight, and that moment is actually a little bit deflated by how heavy they went in this scene. And now we get to the impromptu interview, another point of drama within the community. And in context, I actually think it played out very well, because it showed Superman as a brash and naive kind of superhero, but also extremely good-hearted, a person who's always going to try to make the best decision if he can. And ultimately that is the point of Superman, that he has the ability to do things that other superheroes simply can't. Lois and Clark get in an argument because Superman intervened in a political escalation that very closely mirrors the Ukraine-Russia conflict or the Israel-Palestine conflict. This is one of those aspects where it's not really woke, it's just the undercurrent of the times, and I'm gonna coin a term right now, post-woke. It's not that the movie necessarily has an opinion on these things, it's just that it's politically charged per the energy of the director and the staff making the movie themselves. I think the country is called Barovia or Baravia. I promise you, it's not just Russia and Israel after doing the DBZ fusion dance. The argument in the context of the interview escalates into an argument about Lois and Clark's personal relationship, and this feels a bit underwrought considering we haven't really been introduced to these characters or their relationship dynamics beyond, you know, them macking down in the kitchen. I think the Lois and Clark relationship is one of the aspects of this movie that suffered because of the time restrictions, and I really feel like it was probably James Gunn who wanted to keep the movie shorter rather than longer. I think popular opinion right now is that superhero movies became very bloated, so both Thunderbolts, this movie, and I expect Fantastic Four are probably going to have runtimes around the 2 hour mark. And though this scene didn't really endear me to Lois and Clark's relationship, it succeeded in establishing Superman's idiom. Superman is a Boy Scout with a simplistic and often naive vision of the world in general. justice. But ultimately, Superman has the power to cut the Gordian knot of politics and popular opinion to just do the right thing. In that way, it treads over some of the ground that Snyder's version of the Superman project did, but I think this version does a much better job at capturing the childlike innocence that's inherent to Superman's character. In the next scene, we get to spend some time with Lex Luthor, and I gotta say, this casting choice was excellent. Nicholas Hoult's stock has really increased with me lately, and he really embodies that frustrated egomaniac that Lex Luthor is at his core. It's not enough that he should succeed, everyone else should fail. It's not enough that he's the best, no one should talk about anyone but him. And since he learned about Superman's hideout in the very first scene, he launches an assault on there and destroys his robots, all his technology, and steals his parents' message from the computer. I guess this was an aspect I failed to mention. When Superman is recovering from damage, he listens to a message from his Kryptonian parents, and he mentions this to Lois during their interview. Well, it turns out that that message had a second part. And this is another spoiler within a spoiler, because this is going to cause a lot of drama for more traditional Superman fans, because it paints his Kryptonian parents more like conquerors, telling Superman to lord over the spiritually and mentally weaker humans of planet Earth. I mean, given some of the scenes of these civilians just standing around while giant monsters are battling in the Central Park, I kinda have a hard time arguing with them in the context of this universe. Now, this causes a huge blow up for Superman, but while the assault on the Fortress of Solitude is happening, Superman is battling kaiju, literally called kaiju, in the middle of Metropolis, and this is when we're introduced to the Justice Gang. Most likely going to end up as the Justice Society, as James Gunn has openly talked about seeing the future of the DC universe as pocket universes, which I guess is this weird nouveau corporate way of saying we're gonna make films about characters and concern ourselves with connecting them to a cinematic universe later. An aspect of that is that James Gunn has openly critiqued the Marvel production chain, talking about how with the future of DC, they don't want to greenlight movies that don't have a script solidified. And this caused quite a lot of back and forth between Feige and Gunn during this week, but that's not the point in this video. Let's get back into the movie. We got 3 members of the Justice Gang, and I gotta say, every single one of them really pulled their weight. We got Nathan Filion as Guy Gardner, and he brings that much needed comedic relief to the 2 more serious characters, because the Hawkgirl is much more aloof and detached, though I gotta give credit to her actress, Isabela Merced, because she's not afraid to look ugly and get down and dirty in this movie, so I'm pretty excited to see how crazy she gets if she gets a solo movie. And of course, Mr. Terrific, whose casting is just terrific. Edi Gathegi, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, and he really embodies this role of a character who is essentially the DC version of Iron Man. He's so damn good with technology, he was able to turn himself into a superhero. He advertises this openly. He established a team so that he could promote himself further. So he's got this cavalier, know-it-all attitude, but much like Superman with his strength, he can back it up with his technique. And it gives them a really good dynamic against each other where they're much more like contemporaries. They very much see eye to eye. Though fundamentally, Superman disagrees with everyone on the aspects of morality, and we see that in the way that the Justice Gang tries to handle the kaiju much more violently. While during this entire scene, Superman is saving people, dogs, and even a squirrel. And this squirrel scene in particular was apparently very contentious with the test audiences. Apparently they found it too silly for Superman, and what little faith I had in test audiences, I just lost. Because in my eyes, this might be the most important demonstration of Superman's character in this entire movie. It not only demonstrates that he's the type of person to stop and save a squirrel, but also that he has the ability to save the squirrel, and that he can do this while still trying to save the thing that is attempting to kill him. This puts Superman in a much more positive light than Snyder's vision, and I'm sorry to all the Snyder fans out there, but this is how I like to see my Superman. Meanwhile, Lex Luthor is demonstrating his character by breaking and entering into private property, destroying Superman's base, and assaulting his dog. And when Lex releases the full message from Superman's parents, it turns the crowd on him immediately, which is just comical as he literally just crawled out from under the giant monster's corpse. Some random guy even throws a can at the back of Superman's head, which I guess looked really good in the trailer, but felt completely atonal in this moment. I mean, where did bro even get the can? Superman picks up all the litter during the monster fights. And I actually gotta wonder how lore appropriate this is, is to Superman's parents in the comic. Comment down below if you know more about that. I'm not really educated on the Superman comics at all. Superman returns to the Fortress of Solitude just in time to watch his favorite robot die. And here we have another classic Gunnerism where he can't play a serious moment straight. It's just impossible for this man. And I also gotta point out a little bit of symbology here. This robot is number 4, played by Alan Tudyk, by the way, a very good actor. And I gotta wonder if this is James Gunn throwing strays at Fantastic Four, calling him out on their aesthetic and saying that isn't gonna work in modern cinema. Superman discovers that Krypto is missing, and it's what gives him the impetus to go and confront Lex Luthor. And when he does, we see the selfie girl again, taking pictures as he's raging in the background, and I want to point out an odd social media focus of this movie. Maybe it's because Hollywood people work in the entertainment business, and so they rely on marketing to people on social media to really get that outreach. So they really perceive social media critique as attacks on them, but for most people, when you log off social media, you just log off social media. I guess when you're literally the strongest thing in the world like Superman, what people clickety-clack on the computer and in their mobile phones matters to you, I guess. There's even an offhanded mention of internet propaganda here. Another one of those post-woke things where the phrase has just sunk itself into James Gunn's brain, and it's not really pointed in any particular direction, but it will be brought up in strong fashion later. Superman goes to Lois Lane for advice, and this is yet another instance of Gunnerisms. They're really thick in the middle of this movie now that I'm thinking about it. While Superman's talking about his lost dog and how he's gonna have to battle Lex Luthor and how he feels betrayed by his parents and how he doesn't know who he is anymore, you got the Justice Gang battling some space jellyfish in the background and just blowing the absolute crap out of it, and Superman kind of nonchalantly brushes it off like, oh, they can handle it, we don't need to involve ourselves. And before Superman departs to turn himself into the military, he shares an pretty awkward hug with Lois. And again, I think it just suffers because we literally only got one scene with them up until this point, and it was the blow-up scene. Without any true setup, the Lois and Clark relationship lacked much impact to me. Though there are some lines here that demonstrate Superman's character very well. He's going to save Krypto even though he's not a good dog. He says something like that. He's not even a good dog, not even a loyal dog, but he's probably scared. And I think that's what really kept holding this movie together, was just that Superman was the best version of Superman we've seen in pretty much 25 years plus. Now, when Superman turns himself in, the military is actually given control of Superman over to Lex Luthor, and Lex Luthor decides to stick him in a pocket dimension. And we were introduced to this earlier with a couple comedic scenes, but this is where the sci-fi stuff really goes off the rails. And if you haven't bought into the plot by now, you're definitely gonna get hard checked here in a couple minutes. This is where we meet Metamorpho, and this person has the ability to change themselves into any element, even an element that they've never seen before, so Lex uses him to become kryptonite. And while it's established in the plot that they haven't found any kryptonite on Earth, we have some kryptonite right here, and he uses it to torture Superman for no real reason, just because Lex Luthor does not like him. Truly evil. And I mean unashamedly evil, because he also has ex-girlfriends, bloggers, even people who gave him bad food deliveries locked up in this pocket universe. We also have another post-woke note here, the army of monkeys on the computers writing internet propaganda. And before this movie came out, James Gunn made some comments about all the negative detractors of Superman, how they're probably 12 or they're from India and they're bot farming. And I just find it fascinating how the people who control the mainstream advertising channels seem to view individuals on the internet who just don't like the stuff they're putting out. Now, Metamorpho isn't torturing Superman voluntarily. This is when we're introduced to Baby Joe, aka Grogu Mineral Edition. And this is the moment that I knew all was lost and we were trapped in the multiverse of madness. Snap back to reality, and we join Lois Lane in her quest for the location of Superman, and this is where Selfie Girl actually becomes very important, as she's apparently an ex of Jimmy Olsen and their way to find out what Lex Luthor is up to. Another example of the very tight screenwriting, a bit of Chekhov's gun, or perhaps Chekhov's selfie. And now that Lois has the location of Superman, she appeals to the Justice Gang to help her get him back from the pocket dimension, and they have a bit of an argument over the morality of it all, whether they should intervene or not. Bit on the nose related to today's political climate, but ultimately Mr. Terrific is the one who decides to help her, really out of ego. in many ways mirroring Superman's desire to save everyone he can despite everyone saying he can't. During this scene, we see the empty Justice Society headquarters, and I imagine this is set up for a later scene when they will fill this with younger and newer superheroes. But in reality, Mr. Terrific is brand new to the live-action movies himself, and he's a very underrated character. I'm very happy to see him get the spotlight. He gets a decent power demonstration here, with some pretty good camera work, actually very punchy in that classic James Gunn style. And while Mr. T is attempting to hack into the pocket dimension, because apparently you can hack into pocket dimensions, Superman is being interrogated by Lex Luthor, and did I say that Nicholas Hoult is really good as Lex Luthor? Because this is another scene where he shines. Note that I'm complimenting his acting, not necessarily this scene, because this scene is actually pretty wacky. Lex has kidnapped a character from earlier in the film who was running a falafel shop. He appeared for literally one scene and helped Superman out of a hole. I mean, implying that Superman needs help out of a hole, of course. But it really presents a lot of logical errors with the whole Lex Luthor Superman having battled for 3 years scenario. Primarily, why this guy? This isn't even the last human being that Superman interacted with. Is it just because this guy praised Superman so openly in the middle of a public park that we've been to 5 times in this movie already? Lex Luthor is playing Russian roulette with this guy's life in an attempt to get Superman to talk, and before Superman can even say anything, he accidentally kills the guy. And classic Gunnerism, this guy's last words in comical fashion are something like, "It was an honor to serve you food, Superman." This is where the post-woke just completely collapses in on itself, because they obviously had this guy, Indian, Palestinian, somewhere in that area to represent that demographic, because this story is pro-them. It's pro-immigrant, pro-hard worker, pro-America, but it's also so on the nose that I can't help but laugh at it, and pretty much everyone else in my theater did too. But it does develop the plot at least, as Metamorpho, seeing that Lex would kill another human being, decides to help Superman escape. Metamorpho switches off the kryptonite and proceeds to emulate a sun, which is pretty intense, but it's kinda crazy that the guard who's supposed to take out Baby Joe didn't see this happening. However, the execution here is pretty satisfying. Superman speeds over, takes out the guard, saves Baby Joe in a nick of time. Very heroic little tidbit. Superman returns Baby Joe to Metamorpho. They have a bit of a reunion, but then they're immediately accosted by the rest of the guards and fall into a time river that's flowing into a black hole. And depending on whether you bought into the Superman movie, this is either the best scene or the worst scene in the entire movie. As Superman battles these armed guards while flowing down the Proton River into the center of a black hole, Metamorpho had to use most of his body to fight the guards, so he's like a little squid head floating after Superman trying to grab Baby Joe. And Superman is holding this comical looking mineral Grogu thing out of the water, or protein stream, I guess. And to top it all off, before they fall into the center of the black hole, Superman uses his ice breath to literally freeze time. So with the first movie, we're already getting to cosmic level powers. I wonder if James Gunn is crazy enough to have Superman pushing planets, but I feel like it might have been a bit much in the first movie for some people, considering we're just introduced to the character. But I guess within the context of the plot, Superman already being 3 years into his career, it makes some sense. With the help of Mr. T, Superman and the rest managed to escape the pocket dimension, and I gotta give credit to Mr. T because he's definitely birthed some memes here. They decide to take Superman to the Kent farm to heal, and this is the first introduction of the Kents in this film, and at first they felt a lot like caricatures. It wasn't until Superman and Pa Kent had their discussion that I really started to feel the emotion between them, and it speaks to the central theme of this movie being an immigrant film, quote unquote. It's not about where you're born, it's about the ideas you adopt. It's about who you choose to be, the actions you take. And this scene definitely makes the Kents work. I don't know if they're my favorite version of the Kent, but I'm not gonna mind seeing them in the future. They get all mushy, as Ma Kent would say, and Superman manages to find his human center and get his groove back. And in a demonstration of absolute evil, Lex Luthor decides to open the portal to maximum level. And it tears a hole in reality that is starting to rip open Metropolis, and I swear, this version of Lex Luthor would kill every squirrel in the world just to get get a photo op of a mad Superman. The Barovian stage a second invasion against their enemies, and I haven't really talked about this storyline too much, but just know that the leader of them is working with Lex Luthor. Lex Luthor's giving them all their funding, and they think it's so that Lex can get his own country, but it's really just that Lex is so egotistical that a war in the Middle East will draw out Superman and make him killable. It all comes back to Lex Luthor doing it for himself, which makes him a brilliant villain here. Now, thankfully, Superman doesn't have to choose between saving the people and going after Lex because he has the help of the Justice Gang, plus Metamorpho now, and they handle the situation in a much less delicate way than Superman would. And I guess we escape the moral quandary because they're military, right? They're being the aggressors. A bit simplistic, but this superhero movie is trying to maintain a naive, brighter energy, so I'll allow it, I guess. Each hero gets a little time to show off their personality, Guy Gardner taking out the tanks with the middle finger, playing up the character, and Hawkgirl gets down and dirty and super ugly right here and straight up kills the Barovian president with a direct statement that she is not Superman, so I expect her to get her own film in the future. I mean, if you couldn't tell by the way the self-harm squad played out, James Gunn is a very big fan of strong, empowered women. He was the one who pushed Harley Quinn to the forefront of those films, and he's probably gonna do that with Hawkgirl and another character who we'll mention very soon. I think in many ways, this lays the seed for the Kingdom Come storyline that James Gunn was talking about taking this universe, and that would be novel and dynamic if the morality questions in this movie ultimately exploded in, I guess, a redux of the Avengers Civil War. Meanwhile, Mr. T goes with Superman to fight Lex Luthor, and they run into Ultraman and the Engineer. So they have a bit of a superhero battle first. They end up in a baseball stadium. Let's go USA. And now we'll note that Ultraman this whole time has been given direct orders like a fighting game character by Lex Luthor. He has a whole squad of computer geeks who have essentially programmed the optimal solutions to Superman, and they're just feeding them into his brain. So this time they have the grand strategy of taking out Superman's lungs with the nanomachine. And this actually works very well, but it also gives us our payoff on the fisheye lens. Because Superman's idea to escape is just to fly into space with Ultraman and the Engineer on his back, and the way this is played is pretty nice. It's a very heroic scene, very dramatic, but I do find it hilarious that after they impact the ground from literal orbit, Lex Luthor's computer geeks have to make mention that Engineer is still breathing, she's still alive, because, you know, Superman wouldn't intentionally kill someone, even if he had to drop them from the moon like a freaking satellite. Now Superman's in a 1v1 with Ultraman, who's essentially piloted by Lex Luthor. And this is when they reveal that Ultraman is a Superman clone, and Lex Luthor had Superman's DNA all along, which we already knew because he got access to the Fortress of Solitude like 20 minutes into the movie, so this wasn't a reveal to anyone but the character of Superman. I don't know why this was played so dramatically, but then they get into their fight, and it's a decent fight for heavies, readable. The problem when you have two heavies fighting like each other is it can just evolve into Dragon Ball Z style fights like we saw in Man of Steel, where they're just scraping each other's faces across buildings. But because of how the Pocket Universe has set up this rift in the middle of Metropolis, they're actually fighting down in a pit, which brings us to the Proton Stream and the Dark Hole again. Now, Superman doesn't directly kill Ultraman, he just chooses not to save him in a very Batman Begins fashion. And I gotta mention, did anyone else hear Ultraman letting out an oddly bizarro scream as he fell into the Dark Hole? Because I think this is another hint of things to come in the future, the return of Ultraman, perhaps from Bizarro World. At this point, Lex Luthor is completely defenseless and attempts to stop Superman himself, which is foolish because Superman breaks his arm effortlessly, not even attempting to. And this leaves Lex Luthor completely broken, humiliated, exposed, and in this moment he delivers a very good speech about his idiom. How even though he may be compared to the greats like Galileo, he hates that people say his name next to anyone else. It's a truly great villainous moment, and we have the good fortune that Superman caught him in the act because Superman was the one hero who would not have just straight up murdered this guy. Superman claps back with a very atonal and poorly written and generic speech about how he puts one foot in front of the other like everyone else, how he's a human because he feels. They try to play it classic, but it really comes off as corny, and I don't feel like Corinswet really believed these lines. I don't really think anyone in the room really believed these lines. And beyond that, it just wasn't well set up. I think this final speech by Superman was yet another victim of the shortened runtime of this movie. And it definitely looked worse next to Nicholas Hoult's performance, and sadly, Nicholas Hoult is not gonna get an Oscar because this is a superhero movie, but let's at least give him a shout out here. And just like that, Lex Luthor is in the custody of the US government, the Pocket Universe people are released, and the Justice Society gets their due as the heroes of this country, and it kind of changes their characters as well. Superman and Lois do the whole hover kiss thing, but ultimately this was undercut by the lack of writing within their personal relationship. I mean, we only got 2, maybe 3 scenes where they really talked their personal dynamics. In large part, James Gunn reversed the traditional way you would tell a story, or at least made it cyclical. And the romance was the only part where it really didn't work. Pretty much it started hot and heavy, they got into some drama, they learned to love each other again, even though we hadn't really met these characters. And the same thing happened with the Justice Society, where they had trust, lost trust, gain trust. It served to bring you into the story more immediately, it packed a lot of punch, it packed a lot of dramatic tension, but they're gonna have to do a lot more work with the Lois and Clark dynamic in the future if they really want me to care about it. Now that we're at the end, I'm gonna mention some things that bugged me. Lois Lane took up a lot of screen time towards the end of the movie, probably about a half or a third of those final scenes. She essentially represents a story arc onto herself, while you have Superman in his own primary story arc, you have the Justice Society in their own minor story arc with this underlayer of political tension going on. It's a very jam-packed movie for just over 2 hours. Even worse is that the Lois Lane storyline leads to some of the cringier parts of the movie, just off-color comedy that doesn't really work in the context and kind of bring the movie to a halt. Thankfully, the ending really knocks it out of the park, so when you're leaving the theater, you forget all of that, you just remember how strong the idea was. And actually, let me discuss the true ending here, because I forgot to mention, Superman goes back to the Fortress of Solitude to heal. And when he gets there, we're introduced to another super person, Supergirl, which in many ways undercuts the entire premise of this movie, right? How have Superman and Lex Luthor been fighting for 3 years? Supergirl has apparently been flying off planet, going to and fro across the universe, just doing her whole party girl thing, and nobody noticed the whole time. Not only that, Superman didn't mention it to anybody. And somehow the Green Guardian, the alien protector of the planet, didn't notice this either. Mr. Terrific didn't notice with all his technology, Hawkgirl's magic didn't alert her, the government satellites said nothing. It just kinda doesn't make sense, and it deflates a lot of the tension right here at the very end. But fortunately, we've already wrapped up the arc, so it's kind of just like a little PS on the story. And I guess spoilers for Krypto the Superdog, someone I haven't really touched. His bad behavior is all because he's poorly taken care of by the Supergirl character. Superman mentions that she goes to red planets where she can actually experience the effects of alcohol and probably do other things while under the influence of alcohol. And that means she just straight up doesn't even take care of this dog, man. Superman has no authority in this relationship, and I'm not really sure whose creative decision this was. James Gunn? Most likely. He's already announced that there's going to be a Supergirl movie, and he's described it as the rock and roll equivalent of Superman's punk rock. I really don't know what he means by that, but he says that Supergirl is going to be tougher, more hard-nosed, have her own moral code, and I'm wondering if we're jumping the gun on this DC universe. Like, we had so many characters already introduced in this movie, and we're gonna focus on the last one introduced, who we have the least amount of relationship with. It's a very interesting creative decision, and it remains to be seen if the goodwill from Superman will carry over to that project. Let me know in the comments if you're gonna watch Supergirl. The true final scene of this movie is Superman watching footage of the Kents, his now considered his true family, while I'm a Punk Rocker plays, and we fade out with sun on his face. The statement being that kindness is the new punk rock, and I guess being genuine is kind of punk rock, but I don't know about James Gunn describing everything with musical genres. It's definitely that odd kind of corporate speak that I'm not really a fan of, and James Gunn directs a lot of stuff like music videos, so At least for his part, I was happy that he restrained himself from using a lot of licensed music in this film. I think this very end scene was the only time where it was really apparent. And in that way, it works more as a statement of the true theme of the movie, which is just be genuine, and if your genuineness is kindness, like Superman, then there's no need to change your palette for any contemporary audience. And this felt like a direct finger point at Zack Snyder, who made Superman very dark, went very heavy in the Jesus allegories, and the pain and redemption and the taking on of humankind's sins. I also think the way Superman crash lands on the very first scene is a bit of meta commentary on the DC universe as a whole. It's kind of like James Gunn acknowledging that the DC movies are in a very bad state, but they're about to make them great again. Maybe that's a misstatement. The DC movies have never truly been great outside of anomalous $1 billion like Joker. But this problem isn't exclusive to DC. Marvel is also in pretty bad state. Though they had the recent critical success of the Thunderbolts, it didn't really knock it out of the park in the theaters, so it remains to be seen if the Fantastic Four will reignite that desire for the superhero genre in theaters. For what it's worth, I haven't been this interested in superhero movies since probably the Avengers Endgame finale. That's the one that really turned down the fire. So in many ways, the direction James Gunn and Marvel seem to be going are the only real direction they could possibly go, because we already went through a deconstruction. Now you have to go through a genuine revival, or the genre will just completely die, like cowboy movies before it. Because what is a superhero movie except a cowboy movie in another skin? And I kind of discussed that in my review of the Thunderbolts, which I recommend you check out right here. If you've enjoyed this discussion of the Superman film, be sure to like and subscribe. Comment down below all your thoughts on this movie, because I want to know. I want to talk about this with you, and I will catch you in the next video.